I never imagined my fiancé's sister's wedding would begin with the sound of dishes crashing around me, echoing through the steel walls of the industrial kitchen inside the Crestwood Royale, the five-star hotel I owned. Steam rose from the deep sinks, fogging the edges of the overhead lights, and the scent of bleach and leftover food clung so thickly to the air that each breath felt weighted. My dress, a soft champagne satin, Daniel once said made me look like I belonged in a magazine, was plastered to my legs, soaked through from the spray of the faucet. My hands were submerged in greasy, sudsy water, and a tower of dirty plates loomed in front of me, waiting to be scrubbed as if I were the help assigned to this corner of the building. Except I was not the help. I was the owner. Behind me, heels clicked sharply against the linoleum, each step a warning. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. Lorraine Hale. My future mother-in-law stood at the threshold with her arms crossed, watching me as though I were a punishment she had been waiting to administer. Her expression was carved from something colder than marble, and when she spoke, her voice sliced through the clatter of pans. If she wants to marry into this family, she needs to learn how to do real work. Put her in the kitchen where she belongs. The words landed with the weight of a stone dropped into a well. She had said them loud enough for the bridesmaids lingering behind her to hear, and loud enough for the humiliation to settle across the room like smoke. I lifted my eyes from the water, feeling the sting of soap along my fingers, but I stayed silent. Lorraine thrived on reaction, on watching people shrink beneath her, and I refused to give her the pleasure. Sienna Hale stepped into view, next her wedding gown shimmering beneath the fluorescent lights. The contrast was almost cruel. Pearls, lace, delicate beading, all of it meant for a ballroom sparkling with chandeliers, not for a kitchen where trash cans lined the walls. She smoothed her dress with careful hands and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. It's cute that she thought she was a guest. A ripple of laughter followed. The bridesmaids shifted behind her, their curls perfectly pinned, their makeup flawless, their judgment thick in the air. One leaned in toward another and whispered not quietly enough to be missed. She looks like she actually belongs back here. More laughter, more heat rising beneath my skin. More confirmation that not a single person in that bridal suite saw me as anything other than an inconvenience. They had made it abundantly clear all afternoon. They never asked who I was. They never asked my connection to the groom. They never asked why I walked the hallways with the ease of someone who knew every inch of the building. They assumed. They decided. And then they acted as though their assumption were fact. No one knew they were ordering around the woman who owned the hotel hosting their wedding, the woman whose signature approved every vendor contract, the woman whose name sat on every legal document tied to this venue, the woman who had remained quiet, not because she was weak, but because she had been trying for Daniel's sake to be respectful. I finally looked up from the sink. Water dripped from my wrists onto the floor, leaving dark splashes against the tile. My voice came out steady low and calm. You have no idea what you're doing. The sentence stilled the laughter, but it did not end it. Lorraine rolled her eyes in the way people do when they believe they are untouchable. Sienna sighed impatiently, already annoyed that I had not simply continued washing dishes. Then the back door swung open. The metal hinges groaned under the force, and the entire room seemed to freeze. Standing there, his face draining of color, was Harold Benton, the general manager of the Crestwood Royale. His gaze flicked from me to my soaked dress to the mountain of dishes, then to the bridal party. Panic widened his eyes. He opened his mouth ready to speak the truth and put an end to the entire spectacle. I lifted one hand from the water, just enough for him to see the subtle gesture. Do not say a word. His jaw shut instantly. Let them finish digging their own grave, I whispered, my eyes never leaving the women who had spent the last hour treating me as though I were invisible. And just like that, the hook tightened, suspending every person in that room in a silence that begged for the truth none of them saw coming. Before anyone shoved me toward a sink or treated me like background noise, I was a woman who had built a life defined by deliberate, quiet, intentional privacy, and a career that demanded far more strength than anyone in the Hale family had ever bothered to imagine. My name is Mara Ellington, and long before the humiliation of that wedding day, I was the sole owner of Ellington Hospitality, a chain of 5 luxury hotels scattered across the East Coast, including the Crestwood Royale, the crown jewel of the collection. People often assume wealth arrives with noise, with glittering parties and magazine spreads and curated social media feeds, but I learned early that silence is its own kind of armor. My parents, who had built the company from a single renovated bed and breakfast, raised me to understand that being noticed often became a liability. After they passed, leaving everything to me when I was barely 26, I inherited both the empire and the philosophy. Stay quiet, stay humble, stay aware. More importantly, stay cautious. Wealth attracted people who wanted to orbit you, extract from you, or simply bask in the glow of something they had not earned. The truth was, I preferred a life lived behind the scenes. I walked my own hotel corridors without announcing who I was. I listened to staff meetings from the back row. I volunteered anonymously at charity events hosted in my own ballrooms. It wasn't sainthood, it was survival. And then I met Daniel. He was a financial analyst consulting for a renovation project at one of my properties, and from the first moment he looked at me, it felt like he actually saw me. Not my last name, not my inheritance. No one in the company knew I owned the hotel that day, and he treated me like a person with opinions worth hearing, not a title or a bank account. His kindness disarmed me. His quiet humor rooted itself somewhere in my ribs before I even realized it. And unlike so many men who believed wealth should be flaunted like a trophy he loved, that I lived simply, that I didn't advertise my position, that my favorite evenings were spent cooking at home rather than attending fundraisers. Our relationship grew in the small spaces between obligations. He told me about his family, though rarely with enthusiasm. They came from old money, he explained, but also old arrogance. He had left home for college and never truly returned to live under their expectations. He had carved out a career on his own terms, and although he kept contact with them out of duty, he preferred the distance. I assumed that meant they were stiff, maybe snobbish, maybe overly involved in appearances. I had no idea how deeply that arrogance ran. For nearly 2 years, Daniel and I created a world of our own, one where my wealth was something he respected but never exploited. He wasn't like the others, or at least that is what I believed. He proposed on a quiet evening in our apartment with a ring that was modest but chosen with care, and I said yes because the idea of building a future with him felt grounded and safe. His family was polite enough when he told them, though Lorraine's voice over the phone carried a note of surprise that I preferred not to decode. Still, I convinced myself that they simply needed time to know me. Daniel assured me it would be fine. They would come around. And when Sienna got engaged and announced that she wanted her wedding at the Crestwood Royale, I took it as an opportunity. I didn't volunteer ownership information. I never did. Even the hotel staff referred to a board of trust or the Ellington Group when discussing operations publicly. My identity wasn't a secret, but it wasn't advertised either. I allowed Sienna and her wedding planner full autonomy, staying back, keeping my distance, wanting them to enjoy the day without the pressure of knowing I held the keys to the building they used as their backdrop. I thought giving space would help bridge whatever gap existed between us. I imagined that if I approached the event as any future sister-in-law would, maybe they would see me for who I truly was, not the blank canvas they had projected assumptions onto. I had always believed kindness disarms people. I had always believed giving others room to reveal themselves was the most powerful tool in understanding human nature. So, I arrived at the rehearsal dinner with hope tucked somewhere beneath my nerves. The ballroom borrowed soft amber light from chandeliers I had personally selected years before. Crystal glasses shimmered on tables adorned with white roses and linen napkins folded with intricate precision. It should have been beautiful, and in a way it was. But beauty does not cancel discomfort. The moment I approached the Hale family table, I felt the shift. Eyes moved over me with the same quick assessing calculation one might use on a suit jacket to determine whether it was designer or imitation. Lorraine's gaze swept me from hair to shoes, lingering long enough to make her point. I had already failed an exam I did not know I was taking. "What exactly do you bring into this marriage?" she asked, not bothering with a greeting. The question was not about love or compatibility. It was about pedigree. Status. Lines on a resume worth bragging about at country clubs. I kept my smile polite, and Daniel gently squeezed my hand under the table, but the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Then Sienna spoke, adjusting an earring as if preparing herself for the burden of my existence. "We're a very established family. We hope you won't drag us down." Her voice was sweet enough to glaze the cruelty, but not sweet enough to hide it. I felt a flicker of something sharp beneath my ribs, something I chose to swallow because I believed foolishly that people soften when given grace. Daniel apologized on their behalf. "They're stressed about the wedding. They don't mean it." But I saw it, the certainty in their eyes, the belief that they were above me, the assumption that I would bend to earn a place among them. And I realized in that small pivotal moment that I had vastly underestimated the Hale family. I had no idea then just how far their entitlement would go, or how far I would be pushed before everything inside me snapped. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a warm prelude to the wedding, a night where families blended, laughed, and softened toward one another, but from the moment I stepped inside the banquet hall, I could feel the temperature drop. It was not the air conditioning. It was the way conversations paused mid-sentence when I approached, the way heads tilted, as if adjusting lenses to get a better read on me, the way smiles formed slowly and reluctantly as though hospitality were a currency they were unwilling to spend on someone like me. The hall itself was stunning, draped in soft candlelight that danced along the edges of the mirrored walls. Servers glided between tables carrying trays of champagne, and a string quartet played something classical and elegant in the corner. It looked like a picture-perfect evening from the outside, but there is always a seam where glamour unravels, and with the Hales that seam revealed itself almost immediately. Lorraine spotted me before I had even reached the table, her expression tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gave me a look that suggested she had already decided I had failed at something, though I had barely walked through the door. "You're late," she said, though I wasn't. "We started without you." She said it loudly, clearly hoping others would hear and file it away as another flaw. Daniel tried to smooth things over, but Lorraine dismissed him with a flick of her wrist, focusing her scrutiny entirely on me. "What exactly do you bring into this marriage?" she asked, her voice lined with something sharper than curiosity. It was not a question, it was an accusation. I opened my mouth to answer, but Sienna jumped in before I could form a syllable. She looked radiant in her designer white rehearsal dress, her blonde hair curled in perfect waves that tumbled over one shoulder, but her beauty only sharpened the cruelty that lived beneath her words. "We're a very established family," she said with a smile designed for photographs, not sincerity. "We hope you won't drag us down." A few bridesmaids tittered behind their hands as if they were watching a performance meant for their entertainment. My cheeks warmed not with embarrassment, but with something closer to stunned disbelief. I had been insulted by people before, but rarely with such comfortable ease. These were not jabs meant to wound. These were statements of hierarchy, reminders that they believed themselves higher on a ladder they assumed everyone else was climbing. Daniel's fingers found mine under the table. "They're stressed," he whispered. "They don't mean it." He said it softly, but the words hit me hard, exposing a fracture I had not yet realized existed between us. Because they did mean it. They meant every syllable, and his refusal to acknowledge that truth was its own kind of betrayal. I tried to refocus, to breathe through the moment, to remind myself that people say terrible things under pressure. But pressure does not invent character. It reveals it. As the evening continued, the signs only multiplied. When I complimented the floral arrangements, Sienna laughed lightly and said, "It's okay. My taste is more refined than yours. You probably wouldn't understand the vision." When I asked if I could help with anything, Lorraine responded, "Just try not to get in the way." Weddings require a certain level of sophistication. When I reached for a glass of sparkling water, one of the bridesmaids gently nudged my wrist and switched it with a cheaper brand, whispering, "This one's more your style." Every comment was coated in sugar, but not enough to hide the bitterness beneath it. They never said outright that they thought I was beneath them. They let their tone do the talking. The Hale family had mastered the art of condescension, delivering insults disguised as etiquette. I found myself studying them the way one studies a storm cloud rolling across the horizon, aware that lightning might strike, but unsure when. At one point, an older family friend named Patricia pulled me aside and said in a confidential tone, "You're sweet, dear, but you have to understand how this family works. They've known wealth their entire lives. They're used to a certain standard." She let the word hang heavily between us as if its meaning were self-evident. They need to know you can keep up. Keep up. As though my value depended on whether I met an invisible checklist written by people who had never worked a day in hospitality yet carried themselves as if they owned the world. I smiled politely and excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to quiet the buzzing frustration inside my mind. As I walked down the hallway, I overheard two bridesmaids whispering. "She seems nice," one said. "Too nice," the other replied. "Daniel should have chosen someone who fits the family image. His mom is right." And that was the moment something shifted inside me. Not rage, not sadness. Clarity. This was not stress. This was belief. This was entitlement woven into their DNA. This was the shape of the disrespect they felt comfortable handing me now before I was legally tethered to them. I remembered something my mother used to say. People tell you who they are long before you're ready to listen. That night, the Hales spoke loudly without raising their voices. They showed me exactly where they thought I belonged. They had no idea how wrong they were. In the quiet hours after the rehearsal dinner, long after the last champagne flute had been collected and the final guests had drifted out of the ballroom, I lay awake in the hotel suite Daniel and I were sharing, staring at the ceiling as the events of the evening replayed in looping fragments. Lorraine's scrutinizing gaze, Sienna's sugared cruelty, the whispers behind manicured hands, and Daniel's soft, fragile excuses that tried to smooth jagged edges into something safe and digestible. I kept turning his words over in my mind, not because I wanted to be angry with him, but because I wanted to understand why he could not see what had been so unmistakably clear. Maybe it was easier for him not to see. Maybe he had spent his entire life compartmentalizing the worst parts of his family, trimming inconvenient truths to fit the narrative he wanted to believe. Or maybe he had long ago accepted their behavior as normal and expected that I would too. I rolled onto my side and watched the city lights flicker across the window pane, each one a small pulse of life, beyond the insulated world of the Hales. I could do 100 things in moments like this. I could reveal who I was. I could sit Daniel down and explain that while his family measured worth by social pedigree, I measured it by integrity and effort. I could walk into the Hale household the next morning carrying the weight of my last name, my company, my influence, and watch their expressions stiffen as they realized how badly they had miscalculated. I had enough power to shift the entire dynamic in an instant. But I didn't. Not because I wanted to test them or play some manipulative social experiment. That was never my intention. I kept quiet because I genuinely wanted Sienna's wedding to go smoothly, and because revealing my identity now would pull the spotlight toward me when it should have stayed on her. Weddings brought out the worst in tense families, but they were also delicate moments that people remembered forever. I didn't want to be responsible for tarnishing her day, even if she had already made mine uncomfortable. And deeper than that, beyond pride or courtesy, was Daniel. I didn't want to introduce a dynamic that would make him feel as though he were marrying up or marrying into a world he did not belong to. He never once made me feel that way, and I didn't want his family's obsession with status to distort what we had. So I swallowed the truth once more, choosing silence not out of fear, but out of loyalty, out of the belief that patience sometimes allowed people to reveal their better selves. But in the days leading up to the wedding, it became increasingly obvious that the Hales had no better selves to offer. At brunch the next morning, Lorraine asked if I had considered changing my last name early for the sake of unity. Sienna suggested I wear something less distracting for the ceremony rehearsal because the pastel dress I had chosen clashed with the aesthetic she was curating. One bridesmaid asked if I knew how to steam gowns because apparently someone with my background surely did. Every comment was small enough to deny intention if confronted, but pointed enough that I felt each one like the prick of a needle. Daniel missed most of these remarks either because he was out running errands for his sister or because his walls of denial had become so tall they blocked the view. When I tried to bring it up, he kissed my forehead and said, This will all settle after tomorrow. Weddings make people tense. Don't take it personally. But I did take it personally, not because the insults cut deeply, they didn't, but because the indifference cut deeper. I began to understand that keeping my identity private had stopped being a courtesy and had started becoming a shield. I wasn't hiding from them. I was protecting myself from what knowing the truth would bring out in them. The more they dismissed me, the more they revealed the truth of who they were. Their arrogance wasn't circumstantial, it was habitual. And while I hated the things they said, a small part of me was grateful. Better to know someone's character fully before building a life that intertwines yours with theirs. One evening, as I walked the halls of the hotel to check on the preparations, I ran into Harold Benton, the general manager. Harold had run the Crestwood Royale since before I inherited it, and although I trusted him implicitly, he had never spoken to me with more urgency than he did that night. "Do they know who you are?" he asked, his voice hushed but sharp. "Not yet," I said. "And please don't tell them." He looked stunned. "They're speaking to you like you are staff." "I know," I said quietly. "Let it be." His eyes softened once he understood. He nodded, though reluctantly. "You're hoping they show themselves before you show yourself." The phrasing made me pause because it was unintentionally perfect. I had not thought of it in such precise terms, but he was right. I wasn't hiding. I was observing, watching a picture form from the scattered pieces they kept throwing at my feet. By the time the wedding morning arrived, I felt an odd sense of calm. Not resignation, not defeat, but a strange clarity. The Hales had decided who I was long before giving me a chance to speak. They believed themselves superior without knowing a single true thing about me. And so I made a choice not out of pride or deception, but out of certainty I would continue to keep my identity private until the moment it truly mattered. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted validation, but because sometimes the most powerful truth is the one revealed at the exact moment someone believes they have complete control. The morning of the wedding began with a brittle kind of brightness, the kind that looked warm through the windows but carried no actual heat when it touched your skin. I woke early, not because I needed extra time to get ready, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. The rehearsal dinner had revealed enough ugliness to set my expectations low, yet some small part of me, stubborn and hopeful, wondered if the actual wedding day might soften everyone's edges. People behaved differently when they were surrounded by flowers and music and the sweeping grandeur of a ballroom. Maybe joy would loosen their grip on cruelty. Maybe celebration would make room for civility. I held on to that thought as I dressed in a slate blue gown Daniel had chosen for me weeks earlier. He said it brought out the warmth in my skin, that it made me look serene in a way he found comforting. I had smiled then, believing such moments were glimpses of a future we would build together. Now, as I fastened the delicate clasp of my necklace in front of the mirror, I wondered if he still saw me with the same softness, or if he had already begun to shift under the weight of his family's expectations. I met him in the hotel corridor where he greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt hurried rather than affectionate. He looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, but more than that, he looked tense. "They're all a little on edge this morning," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Just try to let things roll off your back." It was ironic how often people who were never targeted by cruelty asked others to ignore it. Still, I nodded, unwilling to start the day with friction. When we reached the main floor of the hotel, everything was a blur of white flowers, clicking cameras, and bustling coordinators. The Crestwood Royale had never looked more magnificent. Draped crystal strands hung from archways, the scent of gardenias floated through the air, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows in golden stripes. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt strangely out of place in the building that bore my legacy. The first sign of trouble appeared before we even reached the bridal suite. The wedding coordinator, a woman named Tessa, whom I had hired personally for her grace under pressure, spotted me walking beside Daniel. A brief flicker of confusion crossed her face, followed by something like discomfort. She approached Daniel quietly. "Should she be back here?" she whispered, not quite softly enough. My eyebrows lifted. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lorraine appeared behind Tessa like a specter summoned by disapproval. "She's fine," Lorraine said, waving a dismissive hand. "We needed extra help earlier. She knows how to be useful." Tessa looked at me again, this time with awkward sympathy, as if she were witnessing a family dynamic she was too professional to question. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, but forced myself to remain composed. This was Sienna's wedding. Not the time for explosions, even deserved ones. Daniel gave me an apologetic look, but the apology was thin, crumbling under the pressure of his unwillingness to confront his mother. We separated soon after. Daniel was pulled toward groomsmen photos, and I was ushered toward the guest area. Or, at least I intended to go there. Instead, the bridesmaids intercepted me near the entrance to the ballroom. "Can you grab a bottle of water?" one asked. "Sienna's parched, and some tissues from the prep table," another added. "She's tearing up and it's messing her mascara." They said it so naturally, as if my role in the wedding had been pre-assigned long before I arrived. I hesitated, and that was all the opening Lorraine needed. She stepped between us, her expression taut with irritation. "If you want acceptance in this family, you should start acting useful," she said, her tone sharpened to a blade. "Today is not about you." I wanted to say that I knew exactly who the day was for. I wanted to remind her that I had chosen not to overshadow anything, not to intervene, not to claim ownership of the hotel she was treating as her personal kingdom. But her voice cut through my restraint, and before I could speak, one of the bridesmaids pressed a used napkin into my hand and said, "Just wipe the spill near the seating chart on your way." Someone knocked a drink over. The insult didn't lie in the task. There was nothing demeaning about cleaning a spill. The insult lay in the assumption behind it, in the confidence with which they placed me in service to them. I walked toward the entrance with the napkin in hand, feeling a heat rise in my stomach. As I crouched to blot the liquid from the marble floor, I heard the unmistakable sound of snickering. "Look," one bridesmaid murmured. "She's actually doing it. I told you she'd fit right in with the staff." Their laughter spread like smoke, thin but suffocating. I stood slowly, letting the napkin fall into the trash, and continued toward the main hall. Twice more I was asked to hand out water bottles. Once I was asked to fetch a steamer. Another time, someone placed a tray of mini pastries in my hands without explanation. "Bring these to the groomsmen," they said. "They're hungry." I felt my pulse quicken, that internal shift when something inside you quietly begins to fracture. And then came the moment that carved itself into my memory with ruthless precision. Daniel walked out of a photo session just in time to see me balancing a tray of sparkling water bottles weaving through a cluster of guests. His brows knitted together, but instead of stepping in, instead of correcting the narrative unfolding around us, instead of offering even a hint of protection, he gave me a strained smile and said, "Please don't make a scene." That was the moment the last fragile thread of benefit of the doubt snapped cleanly in my hands. I wasn't imagining anything. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't misinterpreting stress or nerves. I was being humiliated in my own hotel, and the man who claimed to love me was asking me to endure it quietly. But I stayed silent anyway, not because they deserved my silence, but because the day wasn't over yet, and the truth had a way of arriving exactly when it needed to. I should have expected the moment the line would finally be crossed, but nothing prepared me for how casually it happened, how effortlessly cruelty slipped from their mouths, as if it were the most natural language they spoke. The ceremony had ended an hour earlier, a picturesque montage of vows, soft violin music, and delicate flower petals that masked the rot beneath the surface. Guests drifted toward the cocktail hour in clusters of pastel dresses and tailored suits, their laughter floating across the terrace like a benign summer breeze. I kept to the edges, trying to avoid the gravitational pull of the bridal party, but entitlement had a way of finding me no matter where I stood. I was carrying a small clutch, minding my own business, when Sienna approached with a glass of champagne in her hand, her smile stretched too wide to be sincere. Her bridesmaids hovered behind her like a decorative entourage. "Oh, good, you're here," she said brightly. "Can you hold this a second?" Before I could respond, she pressed the glass into my hand and turned to greet another guest. I stood there stunned, balancing a drink I never agreed to hold. A moment later, she spun back around, tapped the base of the glass still in my hand, and with a perfectly timed flick of her wrist, let the liquid splash across my fingers and up my forearm. The cold champagne soaked the fabric of my dress, dripping down my skin in thin, humiliating streams. Oops, she said, her lips curling into a smirk. Clean it up. You're good at that. The bridesmaids erupted in delighted laughter, the kind that stung not because it was loud, but because it was so unrestrained, so confident in its cruelty. I froze, the chill of the champagne seeping through the layers of my dress, while a hot wave of anger crawled up my spine. Every muscle in my body tightened with the effort not to react. I reminded myself again that this was her wedding day, that losing my composure would only feed their narrative about me. But restraint had never felt so suffocating. As I stepped back to wipe my hand discreetly with a napkin, Lorraine appeared beside me, her expression sharp and calculating. Her eyes flicked to the wet stain on my dress, then to the glass still trembling in my fingers. "Why are you still standing here?" she asked. "Go to the kitchen. We clearly need more hands back there." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if my presence anywhere outside the kitchen were an inconvenience, as if I had already been assigned a role in their hierarchy and my refusal to accept it was an act of defiance. I met her gaze, searching for even a flicker of humanity, but found none. She wasn't frustrated. She wasn't stressed. She simply enjoyed the power of ordering someone she thought beneath her. A nearby uncle chuckled. "Well, she's dressed simply enough," he said. "Easy mistake to make." The laughter that followed spread like wildfire. It didn't matter that my gown was designer or that I carried myself with quiet confidence. They didn't see me. They saw the version of me they had invented, and they clung to it because it made them feel superior. A bridesmaid stepped forward and adjusted a stray curl in her hair. Honestly, she muttered just loud enough for others to hear. She blends in more with the staff than the family. More laughter. More warmth draining from my chest. I wanted to walk away to find Daniel and ask him to stand beside me for once, but as I scanned the crowd, I saw him deep in conversation with groomsmen, oblivious to everything happening on the other side of the terrace. Or worse, choosing to pretend he was. I straightened my spine, swallowing the sharp ache rising in my throat. Standing there, surrounded by people who delighted in reducing me, I realized that the line had not only been crossed, it had been stomped on repeatedly. They weren't testing me. They weren't overwhelmed by wedding stress. They weren't misunderstanding who I was. They believed the version of me they created someone small, someone insignificant, someone who existed to serve them. And as Sienna stepped closer again to reclaim her empty glass, leaning in with a whisper meant only for me. "Try to stay out of photos today. It's not your moment." I understood that whatever illusions I had held about their goodwill were dead. Completely and irrevocably dead. But I stayed silent and walked toward the direction of the kitchen, not because I accepted the role they had thrust upon me, but because the storm brewing inside me needed space. They thought they had put me in my place. They had no idea how wrong they were. I walked toward the service hallway with the kind of numb clarity that only comes after humiliation, sharp enough to sting, but not sharp enough to break you. Every step away from the glamorous reception and toward the utilitarian corridors of the hotel felt like shedding another layer of pretense. Crystal chandeliers faded into fluorescent bulbs, the hum of classical music dissolved into the clatter of dishes and the hiss of industrial sinks. Staff hurried past me with trays and carts, none questioning my presence, because in their eyes, guests didn't come back here unless they belonged. That assumption for the first time that evening worked in my favor. As I crossed the threshold into the kitchen's dishwashing area, a young attendant with a hairnet and tired eyes paused mid-scrub. His brows shot up. Ma'am, you're not supposed to be back here." His confusion wasn't unkind. It was policy speaking through him. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could speak, the wedding coordinator, a frazzled woman who had been darting around all day trying to appease the Hale family, burst in behind me. "She's with them," she said breathlessly. "Lorraine said she's family and wants to help." The attendant nodded acceptance, replacing concern. That was all it took. One authoritative voice, one assumption, and I was absorbed into the machinery of the kitchen as though fate had designed it that way. Someone handed me an apron. Another pointed toward a stack of plates nearly as tall as my shoulder. "We're short-staffed because they changed the schedule last minute," a dishwasher muttered, shaking his head. "If you're here to help, just start where you can." The irony tasted bitter. I owned this entire hotel, yet, at that moment, I blended seamlessly into the very workforce I worked hard to protect, support, and pay fairly. But the symbolism wasn't lost on me. If there was any place to stand in silence and take stock of what had been done to me tonight, it was here, among the people who did the real work. The people the Hale family didn't even have the decency to look at. I slipped the apron over my dress, ignoring the champagne stain that had dried sticky against my skin, and stepped toward the steaming sink. The heat fogged my vision, and for a moment, everything blurred into a hazy swirl of noise and resentment. Then I took the first plate, dipped it into the soapy water, and let the repetitive motion steady my heartbeat. Each scrub became a punctuation mark to everything I could not say aloud. I was angry. I was hurt. But beneath those emotions, something colder and sharper began to take shape, a clarity that had been dormant too long. They thought they were putting me in my place. They thought assigning me to the kitchen proved something about my worth. Instead, it was proving something about theirs. Beside me, a server whispered, "Sorry they sent you here." I saw what happened outside. I didn't answer. The words would have cracked if I tried. Instead, I kept washing, inhaling the scent of lemon detergent and stainless steel until the pressure in my chest loosened. A second server leaned in. "Don't let them get to you. People like that only feel big when they're making someone else feel small." His kindness almost toppled me more than their cruelty. I steadied myself with a breath. Their smallness wasn't my burden, but tonight they had made it a battlefield. A sudden movement at the doorway caught my eye. The general manager, Thomas, stood frozen, his face draining of color when he spotted me elbow-deep in suds. "Ms. Ellington, what on earth?" Panic flickered across his expression as he darted forward, lowering his voice. "Who put you in here? You should not be anywhere near this. This is a liability issue. This is—" I lifted a hand, quiet but firm. "Thomas." "Don't." His jaw clenched. He understood instantly that something larger was happening, something beyond a misplaced guest or an overworked coordinator. He glanced toward the sink, then toward the staff, then back at me with dawning horror. "They did this to you," he whispered. "They ordered you back here." I didn't nod. I didn't need to. The truth was written all over me, the wet dress, the apron, the trembling grip on the plate I hadn't realized I was still holding. He straightened, fury simmering beneath his professional demeanor. "Say the word," he said, "and I will shut this entire event down." I stared at him, feeling the weight of the moment settle around us like thick steam. This was the breaking point, not the humiliation itself, but the realization that I no longer had to tolerate it in silence. Yet something inside me held him back. "Not yet," I murmured. "Let them reveal who they are a little more." His eyes widened at the iciness in my tone. It was the first moment that night when I felt fully, undeniably myself again. And with that, the storm inside me sharpened into purpose. Thomas didn't leave right away. He hovered in the doorway for several seconds, torn between his instinct as a manager to intervene and his understanding that this moment was no longer about hotel protocol. It was about dignity, mine and his, and the dignity of every employee who had ever been spoken to by people like the Hales as though they existed to serve, not to live. Finally, with a curt nod, he turned and strode down the hall toward the ballroom, his posture stiff with outrage. I rinsed another plate, set it aside, and waited. I didn't know exactly what he would do, but I knew Thomas measured composed, fiercely loyal. If he was going to step into that ballroom full of high society guests and the Hale family, he would do so with facts, calm authority, and a level of professional control that would cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. My hands trembled not with fear, but with anticipation. The air around me thickened with steam and adrenaline. A dishwasher nudged me gently. "You okay?" I swallowed, nodded. "I will be." A minute later, the muffled music in the distance stuttered, then stopped entirely. Laughter faded. Conversations died mid-sentence. A silence rippled outward like a wave. Something was happening. I wiped my hands on the apron and moved toward the doorway, staying just out of sight but close enough to hear. Thomas's voice carried calm, controlled firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for the interruption." I have been made aware of a situation that requires immediate clarification. I could picture the Hale family stiffening Lorraine's hand, flying to her chest in that exaggerated performance of victimhood she used whenever someone challenged her authority. The entire ballroom waited. It has come to my attention, Thomas continued, that a member of your party ordered one of our guests into kitchen labor during this event. A gasp cut through the room, followed by nervous chatter. Sienna's voice, sharp and brittle, rose above the murmurs. What are you talking about? If someone wandered where they shouldn't? No, Thomas said, steady as steel. This was not a misunderstanding. I stepped closer to the door, heart pounding. This was a directive, a command, a humiliation. Chairs scraped. Someone whispered, horrified, "Who would do that?" Lorraine's voice cracked like a whip. "Are you accusing my family of something inappropriate?" She offered to help. She knows her place. The room froze. Even through the wall, I felt the shift, the collective recoil from her words, the exposure of her entitlement. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Hale," he said with respect, "you ordered our principal owner into the back of house." The silence that fell next wasn't mere quiet. It was the sound of reality fracturing. Sienna sputtered. "Owner? What do you mean, owner? She's just Daniel's girlfriend. She's nobody." A few guests gasped. Someone muttered, "Did she just say nobody?" Thomas continued unfazed. "Ms. Mara Ellington is the majority owner of Ellington Hospitality Group. This hotel, the Crestwood Royale, belongs to her. Every department, every staff member, every policy follows her leadership." My pulse throbbed in my ears. Even prepared as I was for this moment, hearing my identity laid bare so plainly sent a jolt through me. There was no taking it back now. The ballroom erupted into fragmented whispers. "The owner," she washed dishes. "Oh my God!" Lorraine's voice shook with disbelief, outrage, and fear. "You're lying. She would have said something. She wouldn't have stood there like... She couldn't finish the sentence because the truth hung in the air, illuminated and undeniable. I chose to walk through the kitchen door, then slowly, deliberately, every step echoing against the tile. The room turned toward me in one sweeping motion. Champagne glasses lowered. Forks froze mid-air. My dress was still damp, my apron smeared with soap and steam. Yet I had never felt more in command of a room in my life. She wouldn't have stood there like what I asked softly as I crossed the threshold. Lorraine's face drained of color. Sienna's mascara streaked down her cheeks. Daniel stood frozen as though piecing together the entire evening for the first time. I reached the center of the ballroom, slipped off the apron, folded it neatly, and handed it to a stunned server. Then I lifted my chin. "You put me in the kitchen to teach me my place," I said, projecting without shouting. "Perhaps it's time you learned yours." A hush fell so complete it seemed to swallow the air itself. Lorraine tried to speak but only managed a strangled sound. Sienna shook her head violently. "You tricked us." "No," I replied, gaze steady. "You exposed yourselves." The truth landed like a gavel closing a case. And for the first time all night, I wasn't the one being looked down on. I was the one looking back. The ballroom didn't breathe for several seconds after my words settled into the air, as if the entire room needed time to recalibrate its understanding of what had just happened. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the invisible but undeniable tilt of power, moving away from the Hale family and settling squarely back where it belonged. Lorraine tried to recover first, lifting her chin in a brittle attempt at dignity. "This is ridiculous!" she snapped, though her voice trembled. "You can't embarrass us like this in front of our guests. This is my daughter's wedding." I met her stare evenly. "Or rather, it was," I said. Then I turned slightly toward Thomas, who had stepped behind me in quiet solidarity. As of this moment, I continued all complimentary services extended to the Hale family for this event are revoked. A wave of shock rolled through the room. Guests murmured confused and fascinated. The Hale family's friends, once huddled protectively around them, now shifted uneasily, their alliances suddenly frail. Lorraine sputtered. "You can't just decide that. We have contracts." "Correct. I replied smoothly, and the contracts include clauses regarding behavior toward staff and adherence to venue policies. You violated both, and since I am the owner, I have full authority to enforce those clauses in real time. Thomas stepped forward to support the statement. The staff was verbally demeaned, and a guest was ordered into restricted work areas. Those alone justify immediate penalties. He paused just long enough for the room to absorb it. The Hale event will be billed at full premium rates, effective immediately. Gasps. Someone actually choked on their champagne. Lorraine stared at me as though I had physically struck her. You would destroy my daughter's wedding out of spite. No, I said calmly. Your own actions did that. I am simply documenting the damage. Sienna whipped around to Daniel, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Why didn't you tell us she was rich? She hissed. Why didn't you warn us? Daniel looked helpless, his face pale and drawn. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't know they would treat her like he couldn't finish. The word was too ugly, too accurate. Behind us, guests began to retreat from the Hale family's orbit, some whispering, others outright avoiding eye contact. Reputation in these circles was as fragile as sponge sugar. One crack and the whole sculpture collapsed. I surveyed the room, feeling both the weight and relief of truth finally unearthed. But I wasn't done. Not yet. The Hale corporate account, I said, addressing Lorraine directly, will also be reviewed. Any ongoing partnerships with Ellington Hospitality will be suspended pending investigation. This time, Lorraine staggered as though physically hit. That account is worth millions, she whispered. You wouldn't dare. I would, I said quietly, and I have. A server approached nervously holding an envelope. Ms. Ellington. He said this was prepared earlier for the VIP table, but given the circumstances. I took it, opened it, and discovered the list of additional services the Hale family had requested during the last hour: expedited bar charges, late-night hors d'oeuvres, extension of ballroom time. All marked CUMP because of their status. I folded the paper slowly. Every item on this list will now be billed, I said, at peak rate. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. Lorraine lunged forward, wild with humiliation. You're ruining us. I'm holding you accountable, I corrected. There's a difference. Sienna sank into a chair, shoulders shaking as the magnitude of social fallout dawned on her. Guests exchanged looks that said everything this family wasn't powerful, they were entitled. And entitlement had consequences tonight. Even the band, uncertain whether to continue, sat frozen behind their instruments. I turned to Thomas one final time. Once the event concludes, I said, place the Hale family on the internal blacklist. He nodded without hesitation. They will not be permitted to book at any Ellington property moving forward. Lorraine swayed, grasping the back of a chair. This is barbaric, she whispered. You can't take everything from us over one misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, I said, voice low but carrying. It was a choice. Multiple choices. Humiliation is intentional. Disrespect is intentional. You didn't make a mistake, you revealed your values. And with that, the room turned fully. People stepped back from them. Others whispered apologies to staff members they had previously overlooked. A bridesmaid muttered, I can't believe they did that to the owner. Another guest said, she handled it better than I would have. Sienna finally looked up at me, her face small and trembling. What happens now? I let a long breath fill my lungs before answering. Now, I said, you clean up the mess you made. I didn't mean the dishes. I meant the wreckage of their reputation, their relationships, their false superiority. Tonight, they had tried to bury me. Instead, they buried themselves. Daniel didn't move at first. While the ballroom churned with shock and shifting alliances, he stood frozen near the center of it all, the abandoned music sheets rustling faintly beside him as the air conditioning kicked on. His eyes tracked me not with anger, not even with confusion, but with a dawning recognition that the version of me he thought he knew was only a fragment of the truth. And now the full picture terrified him. When I finally looked directly at him, everyone else in the room seemed to fade, as though the world understood this conversation was inevitable. He swallowed hard before approaching steps slow and tentative, like a man walking across thin ice. Mara, he began, voice thin. I didn't know it was this bad. I held his gaze, feeling the exhaustion of the night settle into my bones. You didn't want to know. The sentence hit him like a physical blow. He blinked rapidly. That's not fair. I was trying to keep the peace. It was Sienna's wedding and everyone was stressed and everyone was stressed. I repeated my voice calm but steady so that made it acceptable to treat me like hired help, to order me around, to humiliate me. He winced. I wasn't part of that. You know I wasn't. You watched it happen, I said. That's participation. His mouth opened then closed. His shoulders sagged under the weight of something he couldn't defend. Around us, whispers threaded through the room like threads pulling apart a tapestry. People pretended not to look, but they did. They watched because the truth unfolding here was more compelling than any wedding spectacle. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had once found endearing. Now it looked like a stall tactic. Mara, I love you. You know that, right? I didn't tell them who you were because I respected your privacy. Because you said you wanted normalcy. Normalcy is one thing, I said quietly. Abuse is another. His face reddened. They're my family. What was I supposed to do? Fight them in the middle of the rehearsal dinner. Make a scene tonight, ruin everything. I stared at him for a long moment. Daniel, they ruined everything. He shook his head desperately. I tried to diffuse things. I tried to get Sienna to apologize earlier, but she said she was too busy. And my mother, she's complicated. You have to understand that I don't have to understand anything I cut in. I only need to acknowledge what happened, and what happened is that you stood next to me and watched them belittle me. You told me not to make a scene while they used me as the scene. His shoulders slumped. I didn't know how to handle it. You didn't want to handle it, I corrected, because handling it would mean confronting the truth about your family. He hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes. I thought you were strong enough to ignore them. Being strong doesn't mean tolerating disrespect, I replied. It means knowing when to walk away. A hush rippled across the ballroom as guests realized what was about to happen. Even the waitstaff paused, sensing the emotional gravity pulling taut. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. So, what are you saying? I reached into my pocket, fingers closing around the engagement ring I had slipped off hours earlier when the first cracks in our future began to show. I held it out to him not with anger, but with clarity. A clarity that had arrived slowly, painfully, and finally. I'm saying this doesn't belong to me anymore. His breath hitched. Mara, please don't do this. Not here. Here is exactly where this needs to happen, I said, because this is where I saw your choice. He shook his head violently. I never chose them over you. Indifference, I said softly, is a choice. The room felt impossibly still. A single violinist held her bow suspended mid-air, unable to look away. Daniel looked at the ring in my hand, then at my face, as if searching for a version of tonight where he could rewrite his actions. But there was none. I can fix this, he whispered. I'll talk to them. I'll make them apologize. You can't fix a foundation that was never stable, I replied. You can only rebuild somewhere else. After several agonizing seconds, he took the ring from my palm with trembling fingers. The weight of it seemed to drain the last bit of color from his face. So this is it, he asked hoarsely. This is goodbye. I exhaled not with sorrow, but with release. Goodbye to them, I said. Goodbye to the version of you who couldn't stand beside me. Goodbye to the life I would have suffocated in. Tears welled in his eyes but didn't fall. He nodded once, a broken acceptance, and just like that, the engagement dissolved not with shouting, not with melodrama, but with truth spoken plainly in a room full of witnesses. Daniel stepped back. I turned away. And the path out of the ballroom, out of that family, became the first path in a long time that felt entirely unquestionably mine. When I stepped out of the ballroom, the cool night air hit me with a clarity that felt almost medicinal, as if the universe itself had opened a window and let the stale, oppressive heaviness of the Hale family drift away behind me. The lights of the Crestwood Royale shimmered against the dark sky, each window glowing softly like a reminder of the life I had built long before any of them tried to diminish me. I walked across the stone terrace, and paused near the fountain, listening to the gentle cascade of water. For the first time all night, my breath felt steady. No more champagne splashing onto my hands. No more clipped commands disguised as etiquette. No more being told not to make a scene while my dignity was scraped away piece by piece. I finally had room to hear my own thoughts again, and what they whispered was simple. I had survived far worse than this, and I had walked away from far more powerful men than Daniel's mother. My businesses, my independence, my sense of self, they were mine long before the Hale family attempted to claim jurisdiction over them. Yet walking away still carried weight. It wasn't the end of an engagement. It was the end of a quietly eroding dream. I had once believed that marrying Daniel meant creating a bridge between two different worlds, but tonight proved that bridges built on denial collapse under the first real storm. Standing near the fountain, I realized something else. Power isn't about status or wealth or ownership. It's about choosing how you show up in moments when others think they control the script. And tonight in the kitchen where Lorraine tried to bury me, I didn't break. I didn't lash out. I observed, waited, and let the truth reveal itself the moment it needed to. That was my power. Not loud, not flashy, clear, precise. I thought back to the guests who had watched everything unfold, the mix of horror guilt and uncomfortable introspection etched across their faces. Some had whispered apologies as I passed by. Others had avoided eye contact, entirely unsure whether to feel embarrassed or relieved that they hadn't been cruel themselves. But whether they liked it or not, they had witnessed a mirror held up to entitlement, and I hoped it left a mark deeper than gossip ever could. Inside, the wedding continued in fractured pieces. The music had resumed, but without conviction. People danced stiffly, more preoccupied with their own reputations than with celebration. Lorraine had disappeared into a corner somewhere, likely trying to salvage the scraps of dignity she had left. Sienna's perfect wedding was now more infamous than picturesque. And Daniel had swallowed his consequences. Perhaps one day he'd understand the true cost of silence. Perhaps he'd even forgive himself. But that was no longer my responsibility. As the minutes passed, a strange calm settled into my chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was something steadier. A kind of inner alignment that comes only after choosing yourself in a room full of people who hoped you wouldn't. I looked up at the hotel again, at the sweeping balconies and the carved stone entrance, and felt a swell of gratitude for the younger version of me who had fought to build something that no one could take away. The Hales didn't have to know my worth for it to exist. Their ignorance didn't diminish a single brick of that building. Their cruelty didn't touch a single inch of my future. And maybe that was the real lesson. People can insult you, underestimate you, order you into kitchens they believe you belong in. But their perception is not your boundary. Your response is. As I made my way toward the valet stand, I paused for a final moment and whispered something to myself, something that came out almost like a vow. They put me in the kitchen to shame me, but they forgot the kitchen is mine too. A slow smile tugged at my lips. Not spiteful, not victorious, just honest. Because sometimes the quiet truth carries more force than the loudest revenge. And now, standing on the edge of a brand new beginning, I wanted to offer a truth to anyone listening to this story. Never let someone else's smallness shrink you. Never confuse silence with peace. Never believe that enduring disrespect is the cost of belonging. You deserve better. Always. If you were watching this moment unfold, if you felt the sting of their words or the weight of their judgment, then ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stood up like I finally did? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your truth too.